It's great to be here, and Leah, thank you for saying multiplying these two numbers doesn't work. I could not have asked for a better lead into my talk, which is titled Risk is Not a Hammer and Most Hazards Aren't Nails, because it's all about this. And so by way of introduction, as Franzi said, I do a lot of work in threat modeling, including work at Microsoft, where I took a detour to fix auto-run. I'll talk about that. And since leaving, I help people threat model. And as I do this, people always bring up risk as a thing to talk about. And so I want to start with some quick audience polls. Please raise your hand and keep it up if you've ever used risk to quantify a cybersecurity issue. We have some. Was the data that you needed easily accessible at all? Oh man, all the hands are gone already. Did the quantification actually lead to a result that you wanted? Leah, you have your hand up. I've got a couple of other partial hands, but almost no one. And so my thesis statement here is people treat risk analysis as if it's a hammer, which is gonna solve their cyber problems for them. And a couple of sub-theses here. Risk is treated as an axiom. Risk doesn't really solve all our problems. It doesn't drive the nails that we hope it drives. And this leads to cognitive dissonance and also, I believe, to research opportunities. So what I want to talk to you today about comes in three parts. I want to set up the problem by talking about how risk is really used pervasively to define cybersecurity for businesses. I want to talk about some of the reasons that I think risk quantification is limited. And then I want to go into some research implications and opportunities. So first, the word risk is used pervasively in business. The NIST Cybersecurity Framework, one of the primary documents that drives how American businesses engage with information security, opens with the words, "This framework provides guidance to manage cybersecurity risks." The EU Cyber Resilience Act, which was passed recently, uses it 178 times across its 112 pages. And for this talk, I just want you to take as a given that people talking about risk really is pervasive, and it relates to threat modeling. My interest in this is very practical because I run into this, and so let me explain what threat modeling is. Threat modeling is using models to think about security. And when I say threats, in contrast to the question we got where someone was using the term threats to refer to threat actors, I'm using it to refer to possible future problems. He threatened to beat me up if I didn't give him my lunch money. I think about threat modeling as the measure twice, cut once of security. If you've worked in a shop, we measure twice because if you cut material, it becomes waste. The waste in organizations is human effort. We build code that doesn't do the security things we want it to do, and then we get into arguments about whether or not it should actually launch. And I love this Frank Lloyd Wright quote. He said, "You can fix it on the drawing board with an eraser or on the job site with a sledgehammer." I like to think of threat modeling as the eraser of software. So how do we do that? We use a 4-question framework. We ask 4 very simple questions. What are we working on? What can go wrong? What are we going to do about it? And did we do a good job? Things you may have seen that are associated with threat modeling, like data flow diagrams and STRIDE, are ways to answer these questions. You can learn more, the Threat Modeler Manifesto. As Franzi mentioned, I have some books on the subject. And I believe that the relationship between threat and risk is quantifying a threat produces a risk. So if we ask the question, what can go wrong? And the answer is easily addressed. Please fix your S3 buckets. We don't need to do a risk management calculation. We can simply tell people to do this and hopefully things will get better. If it's not easily addressed, then we get into the risk management side of things. So, risk, by the way, means an awful lot of things. David Spiegelhalter is the chair of the Center for Risk and Evidence Communication at Cambridge, And he says, risk can mean almost anything you want it to, which, as a concept to try and drive change, makes it very slippery and hard to do. But risk is very fundamentally intertwined with the idea of management. When we say things like risk, people start talking about measurement or assessment. They start talking about management, reduction, residual risk. And this is hard. And people doing the work know that they lack numbers, to the point where some folks, Hubbard and Searson, actually wrote a book on how to measure things, because this problem of we don't have these numbers which we would like is pervasive. By the way, this talk is focused on risk quantification, and I'm going to put it in all caps. When I'm talking about a quantified or a mathematical treatment, we multiply two things together, we get a number. And this number is, we are told, is a crucial input to defender decisions. We have to think about risk. And again, I'm not using it in this broad English sense, like defense in depth is what we would normally call in English risk reduction. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the either mathematical or mathy sense of the word. And so this goes back a long time. There's this great book by Peter Bernstein on a history of risk. Gambling, as it turns out, is at the heart of our understanding of risk. There is a correspondence between the mathematicians Pascal and Fermat, who talked about risk and who the problem they were working on was two people are gambling, one of them is ahead, they have to leave the game. What's the fair way to divide the pot? And a huge amount of our mathematical risk analysis comes out of that correspondence. And these, along with pension plans, along with stock analysis, all depend on what I think of as iteration. We get to roll the dice over and over, or we get to think about rolling the dice over and over. And that leads me to the limits of quantification. So the first limit is this iteration. We have these repeated chances. If we can talk about coin flips, we can do so because there are lots of coin flips. And this allows us to make a prediction, like if I roll a D10, 1 in 10 times, I'll get a 9. And then I can roll the dice 10 times and see if that actually works. And if I don't, if I get 3 9s or 4 9s, if I get 4 9s, I'm going to assume my die is loaded. It lets us test if our expectation is reasonable. It lets us analyze what's going on. And empirically, this is just hard in cybersecurity. There's years of watching people fall down when they start talking about risk is what leads to this talk and the investigation that I'm doing about why this is. And I have 2 theories I want to share. One is it's hard to quantify either likelihood or impact, in part because the relationship between I have a cross-site scripting attack over here and I'm in a room with lawyers over here because there was a breach is really actually very nebulous. In contrast, if I am buying a new house and there is a penny stuck in the fuse box, I can believe that there is a serious fire risk, that the direct relationship between cause and effect, which exists in much of the physical world, is simply not present. And I will call out the Scientia Institute, who are doing some impact data around data breaches. It's very cool. But it's still hard to quantify all of the risks that we run into. There are risks which are not data breach risks. How do we think about those? The other belief that I have is that most business decisions are not about risk. They're about a choice between multiple competing alternatives. Do I do A, B, or C? And the risk part is not the part to which the decision is sensitive. The risk numbers that we may come up with are simply not that important to the people who are making the decision. And I'm going to give you an example of this. I mentioned auto run. And so for those of you who are not familiar, auto run was a feature in Windows. It used to run code when you attached storage like a USB key. And it was widely abused by attackers, ranging from malware developers to APTs. And Microsoft had a downloadable fix, but it wasn't widely used. In 2010, I developed some data that allowed us to drive the fix into Windows Update, and I spent a lot of time in meetings talking about both that data and the decision. And the internal conflict was only somewhat influenced by the numbers that I had. The real concern that people had inside the company was we didn't want to break the Windows Update pipeline for delivering updates and patches. And they were concerned that if we changed the behavior that Windows had, we would break that pipeline. So this is about lowercase risk, right? This is about dangers, it's about hazards, but all the quantification in the world didn't solve this problem. The other problem that we have is security adversaries may not iterate. If you add a defense, does the attacker bypass? Do they break your defense? Do they use a different vector? Do they go home? All of these are possible, and so the iteration of 100 coin flips might not be something we can do. And so in industry, I like to use this slide, stop doing risk. Okay, some of you want to take pictures. The slides will be available, but I will let you take the picture before going on to talk about research opportunities and implications. And as I talk about this, I'm going to talk about 3 sets of research opportunities that I think are open to you, that I would love to see people here start to dig into. The first of these is the broad risk literature. I'm going to talk in depth about each of these. The second are the unique properties of cyber. And the third are what other frames are available that might help us more than risk. And the outcomes that I would love to see include research papers. I would love to see translation to practice. I would love to see better standards and regulation come out of better thinking about risk. So first, the broad literature. There's lots and lots of books on risk. Some of them, Escape from Model Land, The Art of Uncertainty, are about the limits of risk in general. Some of them are about the limits of risk communication and how hard it is to actually use risk to communicate with human beings who are not used to thinking about 1% probabilities or 1/10 of 1% probabilities. How do these play out in cyber, I think, is a question that is really, frankly, barely touched in the literature. The second thing is slightly touched in the literature on the idea of uncertainty. There was a paper in the Journal of Cybersecurity where they talked about the dimensions of uncertainty. I think this is actually a very, very rich vein where risk professionals talk about their uncertainty a great deal, and cybersecurity professionals do not talk about uncertainty and how it plays into their decisions. So this brings me to the question of what's unique about cyber. Do we have iterations, right? I made a fairly strong statement that we don't. I feel good about that statement, but maybe I'm wrong, or maybe we have iterations at different levels of abstraction. And there's a difference between all phishing and all phishing delivered, say, to the University of Washington, where we have Proofpoint and Google defenses. And so we can study those two maybe differently. And what are the trade-offs in the levels of abstraction as we think about risk? The next thing that I think is unique is adversary freedom, right? When you have people in what Leah described as extradition-resistant jurisdictions, which I thought was a lovely little turn of phrase, they have way more freedom to act than most other people involved in these iterated things like gambling. When you gamble in Las Vegas, if you cheat, there are consequences. And then the last thing that's unique about cyber is can we overcome all of the problems with data gathering, sharing, and creating actuarial data? My first book, The New School of Information Security, was largely on this problem nearly 20 years ago, and I think at this point I am growing increasingly cynical about the likelihood that we will get better data. My cynicism includes insurance companies. We can talk about that more later. I think we can ask what we can achieve at what cost. How much accuracy do we need? How much precision do we need in our estimates? And what goals do we serve with these properties of data? And what is the cost associated? How much does it cost to get my data 10% more accurate, 50% more accurate, or more precise? And I think we can measure these. And precision is interesting. We can have many people try to quantify some threat, and we can measure their reliability at doing so. We can measure this on an inter-rater basis between different people, and we can measure it with the same people, and they do this with doctors. They will give doctors a description of a case, and they will ask them what disease this person has, and then 3 months later, they'll present them with the same case and see how well they do relative to their own past analyses. And the nifty thing about precision is we can actually measure precision without knowing the real value. And that's scientifically useful because some of those real values are really hard to figure out. How accuracy? I believe it requires iterations. Maybe it doesn't. Prove me wrong, please. I love being proven wrong. It makes me smarter. And I believe every failure gives us data if only we study them. Many of them are very costly. Near misses also give us data. Steve Belevin and I have a paper on learning from aviation about exactly this. But we don't today measure accuracy or precision, and the standards don't set any form of requirement as we're being told to do risk management about how accurate or precise we should be. There's a property of defender cost. How much does it take? I'm gonna skim through this on a time basis. It's worth asking which decisions are worth the investment. I do believe that other factors often dominate the decision. When we're having a discussion inside an organization about should we make this change or not, the choices that we're making are often decided by things other than risk. And security people hate this because we're told that risk drives prioritization. So one thing we might do is measure precision and cost of the various methods. And I talk to people about this and they tell me it's unsatisfying. And I really think that this is a best is the enemy of the good sort of problem where we have these aspirations for what a risk management system is going to do for us. And we're not actually comparing the real world risk management systems we're doing to one another. We're comparing them to this ideal. Last thing I will say is that other frames may really serve us better. When we build bridges, we start with, we have this span. We want a bridge with these properties that go across it. And we don't talk about risk at the beginning. And at the end of the Challenger report, Feynman has a personal commentary in which he talks about NASA's attempts to quantify what he quantifies as what he calls unquantifiable risks because we just don't have enough spacecraft to test them. The other thing I think we can build on is public health. In the world of public health, we measure the outcomes, death, chronic illness that we want to minimize. We measure their rates in some population. And then we have interventions which are designed to limit or which are designed to reduce those rates. And we evaluate them. And I've got a whole stream of work on adapting public health And I think when I compare learning lessons and public health to risk, there's a reason I lean over there. So with that, I want to say thank you very much. This has been Risk is Not a Hammer, and I am happy to take questions. You can email me, you can get these slides. So again, thank you.